And are we, there we go, yeah. We've started recording the session, there we go. So thanks everyone for coming along today to the first research group meeting of the British Art Network research group called New Dialogues, Art Created Historically in Mental Health Settings. So I'm Kate Davey and I'm the training programme manager at Outside In, and I'm the co-lead for this research group along with my colleague Dol, who is an artist, an Outside In ambassador, and also Outside In's outreach coordinator as well now. And Dol's going to be introducing a bit more of a creative activity in a little while. So I'm going to start by giving a bit of context to this session, and I'm going to introduce the British Art Network Research Group and where that's come from in terms of the work that Outside In have been doing over the last few years, and look at some of the questions that we'll be asking as part of this research group as well. So just to quickly run you through the agenda for today so you know what to expect. I'll do my introduction, then I'm going to pass over to Dol, who's going to introduce a more creative activity. And then we're going to hear from some artists and some curators who we have worked with previously in this area of our work. And then we'll have a bit of a break just after 2. And then we'll come back and we'll have a bit more of an open discussion session as well, when you can all get a bit more involved as well. So the research group and the questions that we've devised as part of the research group have come out of years of work by Outside In this area, more recently culminating in a 2-year National Lottery Heritage funded project called New Dialogues. And this project aimed to challenge who has the authority to tell, to create and to curate the various stories that are held in collections and archives that relate to the history of mental health and mental health treatment. So is it medical professionals and academics, as it has been for many years, or can it be artists and can it be people with their own lived experience? So our New Dialogues project was a really huge success, and we're really grateful and inspired by how engaged the artists working on the project have been. And what we did realise as a result of delivering the project is that we are really just scratching the surface in this area, and that there's a real need for more exploration into this area of British art history. And in particular, it raised the importance of involving people and artists with their own lived experience in making decisions in this area. So just to briefly introduce Outside In, for those of you who maybe don't know who we are a UK-wide arts charity that aims to provide a platform for artists who face barriers to the art world for reasons including health, disability, social circumstance or isolation. And we do this through our 3 key programmes of work: our artist development programme, our exhibitions programme and our training programme. So prior to delivering our National Lottery Heritage funded project, we had already been engaging artists with collections of patient-created artwork for a number of years. And the key aim of this area of our work was to change whose voices were heard when it came to things like interpreting, cataloguing and exhibiting work made by artists who had been in mental health settings. So this work started in 2014 with the Graylingwell Heritage Project. And this was a collaborative project that aimed to engage local people with the history of Graylingwell Hospital in Chichester. And this was at a time when it was being redeveloped into residential housing. So as part of that project, Outside In managed a creative team that delivered creative workshops and exhibitions. And then this work expanded in 2017 when we began to deliver our Exploring Collections courses with the Welcome Collection in London. And the second of these courses focused on engaging Outside In artists with Welcome's Arts and Health archives, including the Adamson Collection, encouraging them to respond creatively to their research and explore issues like artist anonymity. And then in 2018, we received funding to deliver the Vaudrey Archive project. So the Vaudrey Archive project was a collaboration with West Sussex Records Office, and it enabled the preservation and digitisation of the Vaudrey archive, which is just under 200 works produced by patients in art therapy sessions between 1951 and 1971. And the project involved a series of consultation sessions with outside-in artists, which looked at innovative ways of thinking about copyright, consent, interpretation, and cataloguing. And we'll hear a little bit more from a couple of the artists who are involved in that project later on this afternoon. So all of this work led to the development of our bigger, more ambitious New Dialogues project in 2019. And this project saw us work with 3 partner organisations across the UK and over 30 outside-in artists, many of whom had their own lived experience of navigating mental health care systems. We worked with the Mental Health Museum in Wakefield, Glenside Hospital Museum in Bristol, and Glasgow Museum's Art Extraordinary Collection in Glasgow. So over 30 outside-in artists worked on the project, exploring these collections and finding themes, objects, and people that resonated with them or their own personal experience. And they then responded creatively in their own individual ways to these collections. And those responses were exhibited alongside works from the collection throughout last year in exhibitions that were all curated by the artists themselves. So this slide just shows a few quotes from artists who were involved in the project. So the first one reads, "Thinking about Mary and her experience, I couldn't stop thinking, what would Mary do now?" And Mary is a patient who's got artwork in the Mental Health Museum collection. The second quote reads, "I got to the part of the patient's voice and thinking about how I might use that. I started to imagine the conversations that could be had and the scenes from the character's point of view. I was dealt a very striking gut feeling. I had to ask myself these hard questions. Was I being stigmatizing using the same old stereotypes? I had preconceived the padded cell to be a barbaric space until I learned of the protective kindness of the space. I've tried to re-envisage it at night time as a comforting space to the patient." And the final one reads, "I'm reminding myself that I entered into this project to cut the red tape restraints and reconnect the compassion, empathy, and context of those of us that live with mental illness, past, present, and future." And I just wanted to read a couple of reflections here from an artist called Kin, who took part in the Glasgow Museum's element of the project. And Kin had been looking at Antonio Jablona's work. And Antonio Jablona is an artist represented in the Art Extraordinary Collection. And the works on the right-hand side of this slide are Kin's works in response to their research into the collection. So Kin says, "How many of us have had the experience of speaking and yet not being heard? Using discarded materials to build with is a key theme running through the Art Extraordinary Collection, but so too is the historic undervaluing of artworks made within spaces of confinement. For artists like Jablona to be heard, the apparatus needs dismantling, so the art produced by artists who happen to be in psychiatric institutions is not undervalued, discarded, or regarded as unimportant." So the New Dialogues project resulted in 4 physical exhibitions across the UK last year and 1 digital exhibition. So this slide shows some images from Another Space Within, which was the virtual exhibition. Then we had Looking to the Light, which was at Glenside Hospital Museum in Bristol. And all of these exhibitions were curated by the artists who took part in the projects. We had Recollections May Vary at the Mental Health Museum in Wakefield. And we had Unlocking the Extraordinary at Kelvin Grove Art Gallery and Projectability in Glasgow. So these previous projects have led us to this point, raising challenges, issues, and questions that we'd like to approach collaboratively with you all. And we're hoping this group will be an opportunity for artists, curators, academics, people with lived experience of mental health issues and mental health treatment to come together and explore this overlooked area, which we feel has the potential to reduce stigma around mental health, engage wider audiences with art and artists from diverse backgrounds, and to stimulate conversations, awareness, and new insights into the intersection between mental health and creativity. So these are our questions really, and we don't expect to answer them all today, but they will be underpinning what we explore as a group over the next year. So the first question is, how can we best interpret and exhibit art that's been created historically in mental health care settings, ensuring that people with their own lived experience are at the centre of interpretation and curation? What is the ethical impact of sharing art created in mental health care settings on the public, the healthcare setting, and the artist? And finally, how can the curatorial process best explore and/or promote wider public conversations around sharing art created in mental health care settings? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and without further ado, I am going to pass over to Dol, who's going to introduce something a little bit more creative now. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Kate. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us for this. It's a research project that I hope you will enjoy being a part of. We want to do something a bit different, a bit less stuffy, to use a possibly unpopular word, but we want it to be a bit more creative. This is about art and mental health, so a little bit of art, a little bit of well-being, and a lot of conversation. So hopefully you've all got some kind of paper and some kind of pen, pencil to hand, or if you're on a tablet and you want to draw digitally, that works too. What I would like us all to do during the session is just to make any sort of notes, marks, anything that feels right to you as you are listening to the speakers. So for instance, if you see a piece of artwork and you want to doodle that down, go for it. If you are struck by a particular phrase, jot it down. What we're trying to do is to create little individual snapshots of people's experience whilst they're connecting, because that's the important thing about all of this, is connecting to the speakers, to our own experience. And also, for me, I visually note take all the time anyway, because it tends to help me when I look back to order my thoughts and think where I was. And this is such a long project over the course of a few months, we might forget when we come back together at the next meeting what we thought about the first one. So this isn't, gold standard art. It doesn't have to be perfect. Perfect doesn't exist anyway. It's your space. Jot down, colour, whatever you want, as long as it makes sense to you. You don't have to share it, but on the second half of when we come back from the break, we will be checking in and sharing what we've recorded. You don't have to show it on camera if you don't want to, but if you want to, great. And we'll try and come up with a few overriding themes, thoughts, or visuals from today's session. So hopefully that all makes sense. Please pop it in the comments if you want me to clarify anything, but basically doodle away is what I'm saying. So thank you very much. Back to Kate.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dol. Yeah, so something to be doing in the background there as well when you're listening to everyone giving their presentations and talks. So next, I'm going to invite Jenny and Sam to do a bit of an in-conversation piece. So Jenny and Sam were both artists involved in the Vaudry Archive project that I mentioned briefly in my presentation. So Jenny and Sam, I will pass over to you two now.
Hello. Thank you, Kate. Hi, everyone. I hope you're well. Me and Jenny are going to read through some blog posts that are online, which you can find after the session. And then we're going to have a little short discussion about each one, so you get an overview of the whole thing.
I'm going to start sharing my screen. Can everyone see that okay?
Yeah, that's fine, Jenny.
Yeah.
Perfect. Cool. I only did this last night, so it's not as good as that other presentation. It was great at the beginning with all the visuals, but yeah, so we're going to talk a bit about the Vaudry Archive project. We need to keep in mind that we did this like 4 years ago when we kind of finished the project, so we've been like trying to re-jog our memories, but actually
yeah, we're a little bit rusty, but some things definitely stick.
Yeah, sure. And I think that kind of brings about the conversation as well, the fact that we like kind of trying to jog each other's memories, but then also certain things that we're like, we definitely remember that thing because that was not great. So yeah, we'll just kind of go through them in weeks, I think is the best way, like partly to jog our memory, but also so you can kind of see how the like process of it worked. So the first week that we had, we were at the West Sussex Records office. So the project was, it kind of started with, you saw on that timeline that in 2014 they had the Grayling Well project, and that was where people would come to the records office and they were kind of compiling all different kind of memories and artifacts and documents, all relating to Grayling Well Hospital, which at the time was being closed down. And that's in Chichester. And one of the things that happened, a man turned up with a bin bag and just kind of put it on the table, and they opened it up and they found, when they looked inside, they found all of these amazing artworks. And so that's what kind of, made the Vawdrey Archive project happen. So within this first session, we kind of had a brief introduction, just like to the kind of idea of archiving and how it kind of works. And also to who Vawdrey was. So he was a doctor at Grayling Well Hospital, and from 1954 till 1987, and he was a psychiatrist at the hospital. So the person who brought these artworks in the bin bag was his son Alan, and he just found them in the attic of their house when he'd been like steering through things. And his dad had just kept hold of them, and they were the artworks that his patients had been making like whilst with him. So they were just kind of introducing us all to the idea of the records office. We had like a tour, had a look behind like the scenes, and also one of the kind of main questions that I put on this slide is just like we started talking about the idea of the archive and also what to call it, and obviously eventually we came up with this with Vawdrey Archive. As just sort of a way of like grouping the artworks, but actually even now we still discuss like, should that be the name of it? Because I mean, one of the kind of things to defend it was that would these artworks have been created without him? And we kind of came to the idea that they wouldn't have done, these were made within sessions with him, but also that kind of takes away the agency from the actual like creators of the artwork.
And also I think like really early on we got involved with our own artwork. So I remember an exercise that we did, I think it was just 5 minutes, where we had colouring pencils and we were given this time just to draw anything and then feed it back to the group. And I feel like that kind of paved the way for how we all kind of responded as we went through the project. And we also, I think, created work and showcased at the end as well.
So we were kind of creating like throughout, I guess, in response. And then that was also weird, wasn't it? Because then it's like we've also created these artworks.
Exactly, we've added to it.
Yeah, but then we're sort of part of the Vawdrey Archive, and then that was weird because he wasn't there. But obviously, again, we wouldn't be there. If the artworks weren't kept by him. This was a kind of constant. I mean, basically the whole project was just questions and chatting and
there was lots of going around in circles, but we did find a way out of the woods, I feel, with lots of it.
Yeah, definitely. So the second session, in the first session, I think we saw like 2 pieces of artwork, or 2 to 4 smaller pieces, and then in the second session, that was kind of the kind of grand unveiling of the artwork, where we actually had everything like laid out. I think it was like the whole of the records office, like every surface had the artworks in it. And I think so I wrote a blog post about that, and I was kind of reflecting on the fact that like it had really stayed with me, just these few art pieces that we've seen before, and that we'd been like really kind of looking forward to seeing more of them. But it was also kind of about that balance of like sort of like I felt quite hungry to see them all, but then also that was almost perverse in a way, because it was like there was always this kind of debate about like the visual richness and the kind of like they just look, when they put them on the wall, we were kind of like, oh, these are amazing, everyone should see them. But then it's also like, are these medical records or are these artworks? And that was another one that we kind of went back and forth with.
I mean, I think the thing for me that stuck in my memory was, because I have my own lived experience of being hospitalized, was that there was just like this emotional kind of wave that came over me. I remember having to sit down and have a few biscuits afterwards, because it, a lot of the content in there is very intense and is very confrontational, and you feel like you have a responsibility to tell these people's stories again in a respectful way, and Vaudrey wrote a dissertation on case 1 and case 2. So we do have his insight, and there are some captions that the artist wrote as well while he wrote for them. So we do have that insight, but obviously it's, staying true to the artist's voice as well.
Yeah. And I think some of the things that came out of reading the dissertation, I think I stupidly read the dissertation on the train and cried, but yeah, I feel like there was a lot of train crying at various points throughout the project.
Yeah.
But, it was really kind of one of the cases that really struck a lot of us was that one of them was a woman who was like a similar age, I think, to how old I was when I was doing the project. And also she, so some of the kind of details about her case was the way that she was being treated and the reasons that she had been kind of admitted to this hospital were just like really like things that now we would be like, no, that's how you should be doing things. It was things like she was a teacher and she would refuse to hit the children, and that was seen as like a kind of like a weakness. I think it was, I can't remember what the wording was, but that was like really analysed as like as though that was her issue. And we were all just like, what, this is just it. So when you look back on things in kind of the context of now, it's like, that's not, yeah, that wouldn't, it would be the opposite. It would be more, you would be admitted if you were hitting the children now. It's like it was like a weird.
I mean, I'll come to it later, but when we look at the history, but I did do some research into the history of the mental health system, and that revealed quite interesting things about how women were treated, but I'll come to that later.
So yeah, on our third session, we went to the Welcome collection. That was a really kind of interesting visit. We talked a lot about the Adamson collection, which is like their big archive of kind of patient artwork, but it was made, Adamson was an artist who was like in the hospital, so he wasn't a medical professional, and people would come to his sessions and kind of make work. Yeah, so it was a different kind of way of looking at things. And yeah, we had this little quote here about that he wasn't analysing the patient's art, so it was a different a kind of scenario. And also there was another person that they were talking about, an artist who that later on through like records that they found had said that she didn't want her work to be shown, but then her family gave permission, and that was something that we struggled with a lot with the kind of second round of the kind of more recent artworks, was that because they were made in like the kind of 50s to 70s, that the reality, and also because Chichester is very small, the kind of reality of like them having families still alive would be quite high. So yeah, we were kind of dealing with that, like how do we kind of work around that you don't want to kind of offend anyone, and that's something that actually in my own kind of personal life going forward I've been thinking about a lot. And I was recently part of a project where I was helping with some PhD research, like as an artist with lived experience, and we were talking about the fact that if we're going to have like pseudonyms, and I was like really adamant that I wanted my name because I didn't want the kind of shame, like often you're anonymized like through like an idea of shame, or that like it will reveal something about your family, and obviously I have a very specific name, nobody else has my name, so I was like, I really want to be named. I
think like that trip to Welcome really kind of opened our eyes up to some pitfalls of it, and I think that was one of the, and another one was how they named and titled the artwork. I remember there being one about opera, and because it had lettering in it, and a lot of the Vaudrey archive had words and text in it, and they just used that as the title, which again will come to you later, but it made us think, how do we want to title these artworks? And also the selections of paintings that Adamson used with examples of his patients. I remember us looking at, I think it was Ron Hampshire's work, and it went from very kind of abstract, dark, to when he was supposedly recovered, to like beautiful landscapes. And it all seemed, it kind of painted the picture for us that it was almost too good an example. And then it made us think, why did Vaudrey pick this certain artwork to keep? And what did that say about him?
Yeah. So even within the collection itself, it's potentially being curated already, like from the beginning. Yeah. So Oh yeah, so then the session 4, we didn't see the kind of more recent artwork until this session. It had just been the case 1 and case 2 previously. Yeah, and again, I've already kind of spoken about the impact of that.
I think because obviously a lot of the other artwork wasn't named, and we didn't have the case 1 or case 2 to kind of assign to it. So this brought up questions of things like how do we talk about them? How do we catalogue them? And you know, there were a lot of similar styles of painting, so do you group them together because they look like they're from the same person? So we had all those kind of questions to consider, I think, from the other artwork as well, and a lot of it was quite violent. And some of it was quite humorous because it was so kind of literal and but also equally like disturbing and moving.
Yeah, but that was also really interesting that there was one work that was really violent, wasn't it, specifically to the doctor, and we thought it was him, basically, Baudry. That was Baudry, and then we were like, what motivated him to keep that one? And yeah, so that was really interesting. That also brought up questions about the kind of curation. Is like maybe he did just keep everything, or yeah, just more questions that we'd love to be able to sort of like find out the answer to, but we never will. So the 5th week we had to talk about the history of Greenwell Hospital. One of the archivists was like really kind of that was like her specialist area. So she spoke to us about that. I think we also talked a bit about like the kind of general history of hospitals and like the treatment of people with mental health issues.
Some of the research I did, I think it was Elaine Showalter, she wrote a book about the history of asylums. And actually, when we were talking about, I think it was case 2, Miss BM, she, as Jenny have said, was put into an institution because, you know, she had an affair and did all these things that at the time society didn't deem as kind of fitting the woman's role. And actually, pre the World Wars, most hospitals were full of women who had broken said rules, and it was only after the World Wars that actually men had more of a presence in the asylums. So I found that really interesting once I kind of looked back at that and thought how interesting that was.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, then we had Colin and Hambrook come and visit. I'm just gonna go really quick because I think we've got like 4 minutes left. Probably okay.
Do we?
I know. I was like, we can literally just talk about this for hours, and well, that's what we
could, yeah.
Just like us talking for hours and hours. So Colin Hambrook came in. He's the editor of Disability Arts Online, I think, and I put here an ally because we kind of showed him the artwork. He had the similar reactions to us as like, you know, this is like he was like saying that there's a really important story here to tell. And just kind of being really enthralled with it all, but also having like lived experience, and you know, he's worked in lots of hospitals as well, and so he did feel like an ally. Then the following week we had our first kind of actual medical professional come in, and yeah, this was the kind of thing that we both immediately remembered when we started talking about the project. Was
straight away, yeah, this is the thing we both went, oh, do you remember when this guy said this?
Yeah, so he said this. He said they're just not special, and Sam reminded me that he repeated it, and we were all just literally sitting there like, what?
We talked about it for like weeks after, but yeah. I think basically what he meant was that it's typical of art therapy subjects to be of what they were, but the way he said it was as if they didn't have any value, and that's what upset us about it.
Yeah, but also the fact that, like, we talked about this the other day, the fact that motifs and kind of that things do have similarities, that in itself is really
that special. And that's just as interesting.
But it was kind of really jarring, and because we'd had all these weeks of kind of, and especially like going to places like the Welcome collection, you know, we were kind of amongst allies and people, artists, or you know, kind of research, like it was, you know, so it was our first kind of like barrier sort of situation. And also we talked about that maybe it was just quite I guess triggering to have a medical professional there when we all have this lived experience, we all have this kind of negative experience in lots of cases, well, in most, cases of
Yeah.
the kind of medical professionals being there and how what their role is. So that was a really interesting week that kind of provoked a lot of discussion. Then the next couple of weeks were spent really getting into the nitty-gritty of cataloging. These were the kind of key things that we had to contend with. So it was about naming the artists or not naming them. Like, it felt weird to refer to them as case 1 and case 2. That's a weird way to refer to a person, and also that was just what Bordy did for his dissertation. So I think we did come to the conclusion that we would call them Miss BM because it wasn't identifiable. But
If we had the initials, we used them. Yeah.
And the titling of the work, like Sam said, like if there was like something, a lot of the times people had like underlined things, so that we would use that as a title, or if something was really kind of bold or obvious, but we tried to stay away from like titling them ourselves because that was a weird thing to do.
Yeah, because I think initially we said that we wanted them untitled, but then we realised that when you search for a catalogue where there's lots of untitled works, you can't actually decipher between one and the other. So we used more of the description to help inform more of a literal interpretation of what you could see. Yeah.
But even then we were worried about interpreting too much. So we'd be like, untitled woman in a dress, but then we're just using our interpretation of what a woman looks like in this, like, it was lots of questions. So again, the similar thing with description, we tried to just describe as much as we could see. What looks like a circle surrounded by something, like, but tried to be very sort of like just like shapes and things, not kind of interpreting things too much. Like, this looks like it's a kettle, when 5 of us thought it looked like that and 5 of us thought it looked like something else.
And then starting the process backwards. So instead of starting with the title, the description, and then the keywords, we started with the keywords first. So it was almost like playing catchphrase in a way, like say what you see, and then we'd work our way systematically back through. So we had like a lot of kind of creative, instinctive responses to feedback on all the other sections.
Yeah, and that was quite a helpful way to do it, wasn't it? Because we could just kind of shout out things.
Yeah, when we did that in pairs, didn't we? A lot of it.
Yeah, so that was helpful. And then the additional related material was things like the dissertation, but like Sam was saying, it was weird, wasn't it, when we were like, additional related material, we're sort of like thinking whether or not to connect. I mean, there were some works we knew they were all by the same person, but then there were others that we were like, are they? And then sometimes people's kind of style that we'd interpreted as being them for a long time would just completely change. So that was another kind of difficult one, but we tried to group things together as much as we could. And then we had a midpoint sharing that there was lots of things that happened. It's very hard to kind of put it all into one thing. But we had a kind of midpoint sharing where we had what was his name, Thomas, somebody from the Print Thorn collection, and he came in and spoke to us about their collection, and that was really helpful. And then we had the final event. So at the midpoint sharing, we showed like the work we've been doing so far. This isn't ours, by the way, this is from the Bordy Archive. And then we had a final event where we had like performances, and we had like kind of the culmination of all the work that we had done alongside the archive work as well. But I feel like I'm missing out loads of things. Also, I missed out a session where Alan came in and spoke to us. He's the son of Dr. Baudry, and he had loads of stuff that his dad had collected. So his dad, when he was in the war, he'd like helped a Japanese soldier, and the soldier had written him a letter like thanking him on a piece of toilet roll, and he'd kept that. So that was also kind of part of this, that Baudry he kept things that were important to him. And from these kind of stories that we had along the way, I've kind of missed out on that bit. We did kind of build up this like of him. Did you feel like that, Sam?
I think so, yeah. And I mean, looking at him as a sort of archiver in his own way himself, although I don't think we'll be using bin bags for the rest of the time.
So we got that kind of sense of him, didn't we, that he obviously kept things that were really special to him, and also that he had this kind of, I don't know, we kind of felt like he was quite caring and potentially not so much.
A lot of his contemporaries weren't using art as therapy at all. So although he can be criticised and was criticised in our group for his approaches, but I mean, those approaches were very of the time, and the treatments there were obviously things that some of them are carried on today, quite shockingly, but others aren't. But the fact that he did try this kind of new technique to help his patients, kind of, I think, how can you not like that, really?
Yeah, and also his son was really lovely. He was so nice.
He was lovely, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I guess that kind of the end. I mean, also I didn't put many images on here because so we kind of made a website, didn't we, at the end? You'll know more about this, Kate. And then it disappeared again. So again, we still kind of are left with that, like, how are the artworks allowed to be shown? Some of them are, like, there's a couple of them on the website. Obviously, you use some in the original PowerPoint that you were like, we're still a bit like, how and when do we show them, and can we?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really great to hear from you both, and I think to add as well that that's an ongoing discussion that we're having with the Records Office about being able to show the work, which I think is also a really interesting part of the Vaudreuil Archive story, and also probably the story of lots of similar archives and collections as well. So yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jenny and Sam.
I'm going to try and stop sharing now.
Thank you.
I know, Sam, you might have to leave soon, but if Jenny's staying around, maybe there's a chance to do some questions about that in the second part, if anyone's interested in finding out a bit more, because I realised that was a whistle-stop tour of the Vaudreuil Archive project, which actually was such a precursor to the work we've done in this area. And I think the questions that you were kind of coming up against during that project will really come up again as part of this research group, because I think they're also relevant to this area of work. Yeah, so thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm going to say here so I can talk about stuff later. Oh,
brilliant. That would be great. Thank you. Thanks both. So now I am going to pass over to Belle Pye, who is an artist who worked with the Art Extraordinary collection at Glasgow Museums as part of our New Dialogues project. So Belle, I'll just share my screen. I can find it. There we go. There we go. So just let me know when you want me to go to the next one.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to see you all. I am speaking to you from Glasgow today, which is where this Outside In Step Up course took place. And the collection that we were able to explore during the course was Joyce Lang's Art Extraordinary collection. And in front of us, we have an image of Joyce Lang, who sadly passed away since we began the course. But there's an image of her here holding a piece of artwork and standing in front of another piece of artwork, both created by Angus McPhee. The artworks are big knitted pieces of clothing, but instead of using yarn, the artist used the grasses that grew around the hospital that he spent a lot of his life in. I'm going to talk about his work in a little bit because it was the work that inspired my process the most. But before that, I'll just say about Joyce Lang briefly. I don't think she would have ever called any of the work not special, I'm glad to say. I think Joyce Lang was very much a believer that the work that she collected was extraordinary. She was Scotland's first art therapist. And if you look into finding out about her work, a lot of the writing about her is about her work at the Barlinnie HMP Special Unit. So she worked in criminal justice settings alongside hospital settings. So if I could get the next slide, please. Aha, it worked. I love it when slides work. So this is Angus McPhee, the artist who's really inspired my practice. And he lived on a croft or a small farm on a Scottish island, but he spent a lot of his life living in a hospital on the mainland. And the work, as I said, that he created was made out of the grasses that he found around the hospital he lived in. He would basically knit them together, sat out in the hospital grounds. Because he was using a live material when he started making these big items of clothing, they would be kind of green and luscious and flexible because the grass was still fresh. And then after they had been preserved for a long time, it would turn into more of this sort of scratchy hay-like consistency instead. And Joyce did an incredible job of preserving his work, because as you can imagine, that material is very delicate and could easily have been broken or destroyed. Angus worked on these large knitted pieces of clothing in the hospital grounds, and his process was to make a piece of clothing, often giant sized, and when he was done, he often just discarded the work and moved on to his next project. So he was really focused on the process, which I think for me was important, because I, like a lot of chronically ill people, do crafts like knitting, like crochet, because the process of making something is very soothing. And often when I finished it, I'll find somewhere or someone to give it to, because I don't actually need 17 hats, but the process of knitting hats is so soothing that I keep doing it. So because I really enjoyed the way Angus worked. Oh, before I move on, I should say as well, whilst we're discussing how work is preserved or not, that Angus would often keep a lot of his creations under his bed in the ward, and that every now and again the nurses would put their foot down and they would remove all of this work from under his bed. And I believe they used to burn them in the hospital grounds, which, although from a performance art perspective, burning all your work is like a really impressive piece of performance work, this wasn't, as far as I'm aware, Angus choosing to do that. This was the nurses tidying up. So it's a really dramatic difference between the work that Joyce managed to preserve and the work that the nurses who worked on the wards, how they treated his work. If I could go on to the next slide, magic. So I started off by going out into the public spaces near me and using the natural materials I found there. And this is a very, very tiny jacket that I made out of ivy leaves. And I found, interestingly, that for me, sitting out in a public space didn't feel really very safe. I was approached a lot by people, got a lot of unwanted attention doing things out in public spaces. So I ended up retreating back to my flat, which I often consider as my place of sickness, whereas Angus was living in a hospital. For a lot of people like myself, who may have experienced short-term hospital stays, a lot of our time whilst being ill is spent at home. So if I could go on to the next slide, this is an image of what I ended up making towards the end of the project. It's called the Not So Straight Jacket. It is created with items that I found easy to access. So unlike the natural materials that Angus was using, I used clothing I'd been given and yarn that was lying around my house. And I tried to knit these big long sleeves. Even though they were in a synthetic material, I tried to give them the feel of roots or trees and to try and connect them back to the materials that Angus was using. And just the last slide there, please, magic. I was able to exhibit this work. The physical jacket went on display at Project Abilities Gallery, and this photograph went on display at Kelvin Grove. And the reason that I chose this photograph for the jacket was because as I looked back over the patient artworks and also over my own experience, I found this constant contrast of hidden people or hiding people. So a lot of what we've already discussed about patients' voices maybe being hidden or not being recorded, that a lot of patients' lives are recorded by medical professionals or by, police reports or criminal justice documents rather than their own voices, and people being restricted to certain locations. But also the fact that as a mentally ill person, quite a lot of the time I choose to hide because the world is really scary and overwhelming. And a lot of the time for me, hiding or protecting myself is a choice that I make, and rather than something that someone else is doing. And all the complexities of trying to navigate being exposed, trying to protect yourself, feeling vulnerable, but also not feeling heard. I think as far as the experience of looking back over patient artworks, my opinions have shifted and changed, but the most important thing I think for patient artworks is that they are displayed with the artist's consent, that the artist can choose if they want work to be shared or exhibited, and they can choose how it's described or framed. One of my pet peeves is if an artist is known to have been a psychiatric patient, people start to do a bit of armchair psychoanalysis on it, which they probably wouldn't do if they weren't aware of that piece of information. So I think it's really important that an artist chooses how much information they want to share about themselves. But also that gets really, really tricky when you've got work that has been made by people who have passed on, because often their name won't even have been recorded, or if it has been recorded, the way that work is shared could impact family members or people that knew them, or people that were working with them. So I think it's a really challenging question, but one that I'm really excited to explore further with you all. Yeah, I think that's everything. Thank you very much, Kate, for doing the slides for me there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Belle. That's really great to hear about your own kind of journey through exploring the work of Angus McPhee and taking what he did as inspiration and asking yourself some of those questions as well about how we display work, how we talk about the artist, all of those kinds of really important questions. So thank you very much. Our final in conversation before we have a bit of a break, I'm going to now invite Michelle Duxbury and Jane Stockdale to do their in conversation. So Michelle is an outside-in artist and was part of the New Dialogues project with the Mental Health Museum in Wakefield. And Jane Stockdale is curator at the Mental Health Museum. So I'll pass over to you two now.
Hi everyone, it's really interesting to be here. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So Michelle and I, we did an in conversation event following our project at the Art House quite recently, and we thought we would bring some of the things we discussed to you today, as they're, listening to Samantha and Jennifer and Belle talk there. A lot of the things that we discussed and were part of our course and the debates all the artists had together have come up here already this afternoon. Things like the historic undervaluing of the artwork, the kind of ethical discussions around displaying artwork when we don't have necessarily consent historically. So we thought we would just go through some of those today. And one of the things we first came up against was we don't have an awful lot of art at the Mental Health Museum in our collection. And I think this this says a lot. This exposes a lot of those things that have already been mentioned this afternoon, in that these works weren't valued. We know that there was a lot of creative work taking place. We know that from the case notes of patients and from some of the records about the hospital. We talked about whether this was created as an artistic expression for people as artists, or whether it was work created as part of providing useful practical materials for the hospital itself. We do know that some people created things that that weren't then subsequently collected, and they were probably destroyed. So this was one of the first kind of issues we came up against, and so we had to be kind of quite creative about how we approached our own collection. And of course, some of the works, I know Mary Frances Heaton's were probably perhaps some of the core work that's been left to us. These are the samplers, and they were part of our inspiration from the beginning, weren't they?
Yeah, I think that it was mainly, yeah, there was the Mary Heaton stuff, and there was a few pieces, wasn't there? The like some of the carved wood pieces, but then we had conversations around whether they were actually made as art, or whether they were sort of like being made more as, you know, crafted objects to sell and things like that. Am I right in thinking that one of those, like the person who made it, like damaged it deliberately?
Yeah, we think this is the case with the lectern that was made for the church, and of course then that did sort of expose that discussion around, are these commissioned pieces? And so whether this particular individual, if they didn't have a faith in that way, were they protesting about being asked to create something for a particular environment that they didn't want to do? So how free people were to create their own art. Yeah, that was a really interesting example of that, wasn't it?
Yeah, and then I think, like, going back to the Mary Heaton stuff, that was one of the key points where we had a lot of conversations around, like, the ethical challenges, because that very much related to Mary Heaton's work. And one of the things that sort of we were having conversations around whether her work has sort of like been appropriated by other people to like put their own narratives over the top of, or, you know, or it was kind of like a real, even though they're her stitched words, and so on the surface it feels like we have her stitched words, so we know what, you know, it was coming from her, but then it was like, well, what about, did it all get, you know, it obviously didn't all get kept, so who was deciding what what was retained and what wasn't, and how do we know that it's the full, you know, the full story? And are we just putting our own narratives because of our, you know, feeling like an empathy towards Mary Heaton, and like, you know, having, you know, potentially similar life, you know, circumstances that have happened in life? Are we just actually just sort of co-opting her story a bit to tell through our own lens? And there was lots of conversations sort of like around how you can really have a clarity that it's that person, you know, that you're not speaking over someone, or that they haven't, you know, throughout the duration of time, that the additional layers, that everyone who's been involved in it hasn't put something, you know, sort of like into that sort of that dialogue. So
I think
we probably span ourselves around in circles quite a lot.
And maybe it kind of goes back to what Samantha and Jennifer as well were saying about the Vaudrey collection, is how do you label it? How do you think it's that issue of consent? So for people that might not have seen Mary's samplers, they were created, she was in the Wakefield Asylum in the Victorian period, and she wrote and she created these beautiful works of art which were also like protest letters in a way, being within the hospital system. And so the question, of course, is we as museums want to uncover lots of stories that might not previously have been on display, but how do we present Mary as she would want to be presented? And I think, rather as Samantha and Jennifer were saying, maybe we will never get to a stage of feeling secure that we have given her a space to have a voice in, but we almost want to say as little as possible about that, because we don't want to impose, as you were saying, Michelle, our own kind of perspective on that. And it's how we keep as close and as true to that story as possible.
Yeah, I think it was interesting because I went in with a very particular viewpoint about Mary Heaton and how she'd been treated by the system and everything. But in sort of discussing things, that there were other people in the group who were kind of well, actually, maybe Mary Heaton did need to be in the asylum. Maybe it was a safe space for her to be and to be able to vent. And looking at all those different perspectives, because we do have a tendency to put our own ideas about things in she was this woman who was being very treated in a very misogynistic sort of paternalistic way, but she could be a woman who was being treated like that but also benefited from being in the asylum. And because I was I'm very sort of anti psychiatry and the anti-structures and systems, my initial it took me back a little bit to go, oh yeah, that's a really valid point. And also, why can't she be, I guess, this kind of messy person with mental health illness, and her voice is still important. Her stories are still important. And why do we have to, why is there this approach from various angles of wanting to sanitize everything, and it's only happy stories? And we had, because we talked a lot then, because some of the stuff that we did have from the collection was things like photographs of the asylum over time, and how they presented themselves to the outside world in comparison to maybe how some of the people who were sort of staying there felt about it. And this whole why does everything always have to be neat and tidy and sanitized? And I found that a really interesting, it's why can't it just be messy, but your voice is still valid even if you're messy, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the other interesting sort of aspects we thought about was the difference between, for us, showing collections within other historical objects. And of course, as kind of we've said earlier this afternoon, it's always been skewed towards a medical viewpoint, and the collection we have is largely medical objects, because they were collected at the time they were collected. It was to say, well, look at the progress we've made. Aren't these wonderful inventions, and how we look at and how we treat mental health conditions. So there's a rebalancing to do by rediscovering some of those stories. So we know that it's important to have them. And we know that they are also really significant in what they do about the stigma of mental health. But there are all these issues in bringing these stories to the fore. And the other thing we really talked about quite a lot was the difference between, for example, as artists displaying work in an art gallery, as opposed to having those relationships with objects. So I wonder what you thought about that, Michelle. Was interesting that came out for you?
Well, what came out for me was that I couldn't make the piece of art that I wanted to make, because the powers that be in the NHS Trust were quite adamantly against I wanted to make a piece of film, and it would relate to the padded room that is in the collection at the Mental Health Museum. And yeah, they were very like, I think they were just a bit, maybe having not dealt with artists that much and not sort of having that concept of like, I think they just thought it would be something awful and tacky and it'd get them into loads of grief. And they kind of didn't want that. So I ended up, which is a bit of a sideline, but actually making a much sort of smaller response with some clay pieces to some found art that was found in some of the magazines that had come into the collection, which was quite interesting in itself. But what I ended up, Jane and I had quite a lot of conversations about things like, you know, how certain work, you know, what spaces it works best in. And so one of the issues with I do quite intensive like soundscape work. And even when I first got the chance to go into the museum, I was like, this would not work in this space because, you know, there's people who like residents, it's an active hospital site and they can come into the museum, and that kind of very oppressive soundscape would, you know, aside from anything, it would have probably just done for everyone who works in the mental health museum. By the end of the day, you'd just be like wanting to smash up the audio. But also, yeah, like the sensitivities of working in different spaces. It was interesting thinking not just in terms of my work personally, but how the work came together from all the artists involved in the courses. But ultimately, what I decided to do after Jane was very supportive about my films and wanted my films to be made anyway, but we were kind of like, it would probably work better outside of this space. And so I ended up setting up a film festival, basically. And just, I actually got some funding and commissioned some like 3 other artists to make artist film around the topic of mental health and mental illness. And hopefully that's actually going to continue as a little film festival. So it was interesting because it got a very different audience through the film festival than it would have done in the gallery space, and it was a much more immersive experience for people, I guess. And we got lots of people who maybe would never go up to the Mental Health Museum who came because it was like in a more sort of like yeah, it was shown at the art house here in Wakefield, which is, you know, it's got gallery spaces in, but it was in a bit more of a relaxed space for people. So yeah.
I think it was really useful to us to think about, because part of the course was about curation, wasn't it? And the impact, the many different objects, the many different impacts one object can have. But then when you put something in relation to it, you know, how that the multiplication effect of that, and how we're trying to do so many things here. We're trying to be a space of creativity. We're trying to tell histories. We're trying to create a space that's comfortable for everyone. And working with the artists was just so rich and rewarding, and that we could explore all these and understand that, you know, we had to make compromises because of the complexity of the site a lot of the time. So yeah, I think just to summarize, because I think we're at the end of our time now, it was kind of a process where you know, each discussion, so many different issues arose from it. This is why this network is so useful, and I'm not sure whether there'll be ultimately answers to some of those, but there was such a lot of rich complexity to it, wasn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the research questions that have been identified, yeah, they were really a good starting point. And I think that, yeah, a lot of what's come out there is just how much need there is for more conversation around this, you know, like, especially around the sort of like for me, like the ethics and consent and things like that, you know, and it's like, how do you get your head around that, you know? Going forward, you can set best practice, but how do you deal with that historically?
Yeah.
And
Great.
sorry we didn't have a nice presentation.
No, I think it's good to have a mixture, isn't it? Some looking at, and then looking at you guys talking. I think that's really interesting. And I think it's a really good point, Michelle, that you made as well about having a kind of formal space to talk about some of these things, because I think certainly in our experience, we've been doing this work over the past 9 years now. And every time we start a new project, we almost go back to the beginning again. So I think it would be really good to have somewhere where we can, really hash out some of these questions and issues, and hopefully maybe produce something like a resource that can be used for projects that kind of focus on this area, both for us as an organisation and for other organisations working with similar collections as well. But brilliant, thank you so much to all of our speakers. It's been really fascinating first hour that's absolutely flown by. So we're going to take a break now. So if everyone's happy to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back together at 2:20 and go on to the next bit of the session, which is a bit more open discussion and a bit more getting you guys involved as well. So I'll see you all in 10 minutes. So Dol, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Kate. So this second half is going to be recorded, but I want to obviously reinforce that this is a safe space for everybody. Only share what you feel comfortable with. If you need to tap out for any reason, feel free to turn your camera off. But we're here if you need to chat afterwards. Just be mindful of the fact that some of the things we're talking about are sensitive. It's the nature of the beast, unfortunately, but these conversations are important, so if you can hang with us, that'd be really good. So I'd like to kind of start by checking back in with our doodle notes. I've been making some as we've been going along, which I've taken some photos and sent to Kate and Charlie, so we might be able to get those up on the screen. Here we go. So this is my desk view. So I've literally just been doodling along as we go, and this will be my record going forward. So I'm sharing this to give you an idea of what I've been writing down. And if you can go to the next one, please. Thank you. So when we had our first speakers, this is what I wrote down, and the first thing that struck me personally was the idea of the art being stored in a bin bag. It really struck me because it's something that I've heard a few times over the different patient artwork project about the just very disposable nature of not only the creativity of the art of the patients, but also the patients themselves in a lot of settings. And as somebody with lived experience, I can absolutely connect with that. On Sam and Jenny's talk, does anybody feel comfortable sharing with anything that struck them, or any doodles that they want to hold up to the camera at all? Let's have a look. I'm here listed off screen for a bit. That's fine, Michelle, don't worry. Belle, you've got something that you would like to share?
Yeah, I also have a doodle, and I'll try and hold it to the camera, but
Thank you.
for me, it was the bin bags as well. Oh no, my Zoom blur is trying to censor me.
Well, forgive messy backgrounds if
there we go. So yeah, awesome. This was just my bin bag of art flying around.
Yeah, no, definitely stuff. Yeah. Is there anything else from that particular section that struck you that you want to sort of share and add to the conversation?
The sentence "they're just not special" has definitely.
Yeah, I put that in big letters on the second page for that, because that really, by show of hands, did that connect with anyone else? Obviously physically or on Zoom or anything? Yeah. So that seems to be something that struck a lot of people, unsurprisingly. So it's something that I feel is important that we record in this way, and that's why the doodle notes are kind of important. Mandy, have you got your hand up to share something from that section?
Yeah, I've sort of been doodling. Again, it was something that Samantha, I've forgotten the other lady's name.
Samantha and Jenny.
Yeah, said about going round in circles, and I did a piece of work that called Going Round in Circles for the Mental Health Museum. So it just made me think of that, and I've just been doodling with wire work. I don't know if you can see it.
Oh, lovely.
A bit of just going round in circles with a bit. I've got some sort of a filter on my thing, and I don't know how to turn it off.
That's right, we can see it. We can see it.
Just doing a bit of doodling with wire work, really.
Amazing. And again, this is the sort of thing that comes out of this connection that we all have to art. Talking about these difficult subjects, sometimes having that creativity, as we all know, helps us manage it in a way. And I love the idea of the physical twisting of, as you've been listening to the narrative. I feel like there's something really important there about that. Thank you for sharing.
It's a bit like the crochet. For me, this is like my version of crochet, if you like.
Yeah, crochet is, I know Bells does a lot of textile work and crochet. I myself have written various articles about how crochet saved my life, because it literally did. And it's a separate practice to my artwork, because I see it as something that's quite mindful, and I also create lots of things that I have no need for, but I enjoy creating them. So people always end up with blankets and stuff at Christmas. So beware. Is there anything anybody else wants to put in about that particular part of the talk? Any words, phrases, questions? Scanning the room. We can always come back, so don't worry about it. Lisa.
There's one just a phrase that came up that I thought was quite poignant, which was strong feelings. They said all the work invoked strong feelings. So that was just
definitely. Strong, very emotive. Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing. So I'm going to go back to the screen share. I'm going to show you the second page of my Samantha and Jenny bit, and then on to the next. So that was the first one, and then so that's the second one. So I've got they're just not special, which and then I've got a really bad drawing of the Graylingwell Hospital. And I liked the thing of say what you see, and I don't know if anybody remembers catchphrase of Mr. Chips, but there's a really rubbish Mr. Chips there. Again, this is how I take notes. So and the idea of more questions and answers, but I really liked their breakdown of the titling, description, keywords, and I feel like in the questions that we're trying to answer as a research group later on, that might come in very important in terms of how we actually tackle and unpick the idea of how we display work historically and going forward. The next one, please. So this is my doodles from Belle's work, and there was a lot there around the texture. I quite like the little doodle I did of Angus McPhee, and I hope I spelt that correctly, what I assume was like a little cow or a horse or something, and then the idea of consent and choice. So again, if anybody else has anything that they would like to share in terms of their doodles or words, or any questions that they may have off the back of Belle's section. Jenny?
So I was like Mandy, I was doing the circle seemed to be a theme. I was just drawing them like over and over again, but it is really helpful to kind of like concentrate as well, isn't it? But I just thought that piece was like amazing. And I put here about the nurses burning the work, and then the therapist is the one who preserves it.
Yeah.
yeah, I just thought that was, yeah, and like you said, Belle, about like if it's a choice to burn the work, then it's something really powerful and deliberate. But if someone else is burning it, it's like the bin bag, isn't it? A bin bag could get thrown on a fire, couldn't it? It's like this kind of, yeah, like throw away, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
the disposable nature of it. Yeah, as Belle very rightly said, if the artist chooses to burn the work, there's that catharsis and performative aspect. And as the sculpture that I made, which was in one of the slides early on for the Mental Health Museum, I actually chose to burn that at the end because it was a paper sculpture made out of my notes. But that was part of my process. That was a conscious decision because I saw it as almost a setting free. So I had a very emotional, I mean, when it happened, I cried my eyes out. I had a very emotional response to it, but it was my choice, not someone else's. So that's obviously really important. I saw some other hands. I know Michelle's got their hand up, but I'm sure I saw someone else's hand. So if was it Morag, did you have your hand up by any chance?
I mean, I did, but I don't know if it's appropriate or not.
Go for it. Of course it is. If you thought it's appropriate.
When it comes to Angus, given that he didn't talk ever, didn't talk when he went back home, I wonder how they had any consent with anything. They are not getting any consent for what they do to his work. Although, I mean, the only other thing I would say is his work was not therapy work because he didn't have an art therapist. When Joyce discovered his work, I think Angus had already left hospital. But because Angus didn't talk, I really feel there's a hell of a lot of consent issues there. A lot of consent issues. And it does kind of annoy me. Especially them burning his stuff when he can't even say yes, no, leave it alone. That bothers me.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It's completely appropriate to bring that up because that's exactly, the sort of thing we need to look at is that, the situations we've been in personally and that we know of as artists and other artists and have explored. I, for example, didn't know that Angus didn't speak. So through this, it puts a different lens then on his work and what has happened to his work. And again, it throws up the question of, unless you have intimate knowledge of the person who created the work, how do you know that consent was given freely, if at all? So yeah, thank you for sharing. Michelle, and then I'm going to come to Carrie.
So I think what I was going to say leads on a little bit from what Morag was saying, because one of the things that really stuck out to me from what Belle had said was the when you were talking about how work should always be displayed with artist consent, that you feel really strongly about that, which I totally agree with, and that it should be the artist who gets to decide how the work is described and how they as an artist are described and how much how much they want to share in that scenario. Because I do think it's and as a disabled artist and some of the organizations that I work with, I feel like I'm just this little token that they want to write about me in a certain way so that they can be like, oh, we're ticking boxes, we've got the nice little token, disabled person there, and it infuriates me. And it's because I don't always want those labels attached to myself, and I feel like it should be down to me when they get attached to myself. So that really stuck out for me, and I think in thinking about all of this, that's really important. So yeah, I thought, thank you for sharing those insights.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, I think we've all had our own experience of being judged or labelled from the outside, and it is an ongoing thing. And when it comes to an artwork, which is an object, art is an extension of self, but that doesn't mean that the identity carries across, and it's how we handle that. And yeah, the word choice is something that I think will come up again and again and again in everything that we do with the research, and it's so important. It's so important, and yet it's quite overlooked, isn't it? Carrie.
Can you hear me now? I wasn't sure if you were going to unmute me or. I'll show you my notebook, and it always looks a bit chaotic. It's severely dyslexic, which I found out when I did my more recent studies. So I don't know if you can see, I do lots of writing because I fear I can't remember, because I've got a very poor working memory. So I panic and have to write everything down. So, and then trying to find my key point is difficult. So I think what I got really struck with was process, and on a personal level, but that need to kind of move the body to almost to, I don't know what word to use, to like distill the brain. You know, if your brain's just going so fast.
To kind of vent everything.
Yeah, well, not quite that, but you know, mindfulness is used such a lot now, and I do go with that. But kind of something else, because I was then struck thinking about in processing and going out, and textiles is my thing. So I was really thrilled to hear what Belle was saying about her work as well, and then using what was round, that natural form, and that the smell of the grasses. So it'd really be evocative, and imagine them living on this little croft with big swathes of grass, and the sensoriness of all that. And but him putting it under his bed, you know, it being maybe so precious without kind of, well, you do put your own interpretation in. But I was just really struck with that, you know, that maybe like a child puts all the teddies together, all the cuddly toys, that it, you know, a bit more than it being the aspect of the creative self. I just felt there was something, I was really hit by that.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think you're right. There is something, and I love the word evocative about when you hear these stories of how these works were created, especially when you have someone like Angus who created from found objects. Essentially, it was things that was in his landscape. So had he been in a different hospital, would he have created? You know, because he wouldn't have necessarily had ready access to the same materials. So there's a lot of, I think, a lot of relatability there in terms of you use what you have, you know, that kind of make, do, amend ethos when you're in a hospital setting becomes even more important, because you really don't have access to what you would choose to have access to, which is that word choice again. And I hear you on the chaotic note taking. You've seen what mine looks like. And I generally have 3 or 4 sketchbooks or notebooks on the go at any one time, because my brain likes to hide things from me. So you're in good company with that one. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Thank you. So if there's any other thoughts or sharings on Belle's part of the presentation, if not, I'm going to move on and share my sketch from Jane and Michelle. So that's that one. And this one is, I think, the 2 things that that struck me about this talk, because I had the pleasure of being part of the Fuller in Conversation event a few months ago, was messy is valid, and the idea of projecting, which I found really interesting. And this idea of, we can't help but connect our own experience, because that's how we view the world, essentially. And is it okay as long as we make sure that we communicate that it's our So rather than shying away from it completely, do we embrace it, but make sure it's very clear that it's our interpretation? So I'm going to open it up to you guys again. Again, same as before, questions, doodles, phrases that came out of that particular part, or anything that you want to share. Jenny.
Hi. I wanted to talk to Michelle maybe about like the idea of the group. So I was thinking a lot about our group that we had for the Vordy project, and like I can't imagine any of us saying, it was kind of like you had someone in the group who was like, I don't know, you know, when they say like devil's advocate or something, he was like trying to see things from the other side. And I thought that was really, yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And I thought like it's very specific to like who's within the group and like what voices are like within the group. And then also about the setting as well, that yours was more clinical and how that kind of affected things. And I've literally just written down here, the NHS couldn't handle it about your artwork. And I was very annoyed about that.
I think, yeah, I do think, because I was fortunate, I was actually a participant in the group, and then Outside In ran it a second time. If it's really noisy because there's traffic going past my studio, but I'm like literally in a greenhouse, so if I don't have the window open, I will just perspire away. Yeah, so I was a participant in the group, and then when they ran the group the second time, I was the course assistant for the group. So I had two very different perspectives. And also, I think like one of the groups was online, one of the groups was in person. There was lots of different dynamics going on. And I would say that the person like who said that about Frances Heaton, and maybe it was Mary Frances Heaton, and maybe it was a safe space for her without like breaching any confidentiality, that I think that mirrored their experience. Mm-hmm. So they weren't sort of doing it to be like devil's advocate. They were just sharing their experience. And like in the first group that I was in, there was quite a few, so we're very, you know, we've done a lot of sort of we were very theory biased and like really into like critical analysis of theory and stuff like that. So it definitely impacted on how our discussions went. And, you know, like we were getting right up there into like, you know, Foucault and stuff like that. So but I do, yeah, I think that kind of just raises the point anyway, that whenever you're doing anything, literally it depends on who's in the group and or who's making the decisions, who's you know, who's coming up with the interpretation, whatever. It's always impacted by the individuals that are within that space.
Yeah. And then also who comes to these sorts of things, because I'm really conscious of the fact that like we're presenting about a project that had like, I think there was like 8 of us. And I talked about the Vordy archive before, like with Kate, I think, for something. And sometimes like there's a couple of things. It's like sometimes it's just like, you know, time. Like this was the project finished like 4 years ago, essentially. Like we've all got different jobs, like our schedules are completely different. Then also we're all dealing with like different lived experiences of things. So obviously like health conditions take over. And then that's really weird that then that voice can't be heard because someone's unwell. And that's like a weird element to things as well, because then we're not having certain people's voices that maybe I shouldn't be here today, maybe somebody else. You know, it's like it's weird.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting, like for me, because there's three people in this group who were in the second course where I was the course administrator. So because I was in a different situation in that group as well, my perspective on it will have been different than their perspective on it. And, you know, like I was there more like, yeah, I think I didn't necessarily, like I tried to retain some element of like, no, I'm not going to put my opinions, but I am very opinionated, so like they did slip in there sometimes.
Did you tell everybody that you'd already done the course as a participant before? Oh, you did?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, the course that Michelle co-facilitated was the one that myself, Joanne Tiffany and Mandy Shepherd were a part of, and it's the one that Jane curates at the museum. So, and we knew that Michelle had done the course previously, because we actually kicked off our sessions with Michelle's presentation and work, so which was super useful because we had no idea what to expect, and that really helped us in that. And it's why it was important for me to make sure that we included as many voices as possible. And we are only at the beginning of this journey, and we want to bring as many people along with us. So, and that's from every facet. So that's from event people to galleries, curators, existing or new, patients, carers, artists, the whole bit, so that we get a really well-rounded point of view. But this felt like a good place to start. And it's really valid what you're saying, Jenny, about, you know, how the group that is that informs the decision, there is obviously going to be a level of, we always bring our own experience to things, but hopefully if we've got a wealth of experience, then we can distill it into something that is kind of universally unique. That's the hope anyway. I'm just really conscious of time, so I just want to read out something that Corinne has put in the chat. So they have put, I like the thought of our interpretation, as everyone has different experience and a work will evoke different emotions in them. So yeah, absolutely that. It would be interesting to work for a work to have several interpretations, including people who are not artists but have lived experiences of mental health. I think that's a really interesting idea. These idea of, you know, how for accessibility there are alt texts. Maybe in terms of these artworks, there should be alternative interpretations or titling or descriptions. The same as a particular piece of film, if you change the music, the whole mood changes. Maybe if you change the description or the narrative, that's an interesting concept. So thank you for that, Corinne. Like I say, I'm very conscious of time, and I know we want to do sum up and what we're doing next time. So what I'm going to say very quickly is everything that you've been doing on your doodle page today, if you feel comfortable, I would love it if you wouldn't mind taking a quick picture and emailing it to Kate or Charlie or myself. The email will go into chat now, and then they will literally be used to create a bit of a pin board, so we can pull out some key ideas, and I'll create a bit of a one-page kind of snapshot, which will be part of our note-taking process as we go forward, if that's all right for everyone. So in a couple of weeks, you'll get an email with just this sort of like, you know, picture on it, which is an overview of everything. But if you think of anything in the meantime, please, we want this to be an open, engaging forum. If you see a document or an article, or send it, because it's all part of what we want to include. So I'm going to hand back to Kate, but I know that Joe, Tiffany's got their hand up, so Kate, that's over to you.
Yeah, I think we've probably got time. I know Mandy and Joe, you've both got your hands up, and Lisa's just put something in the chat as well that I'll just read out, and then I'll come to you, Mandy, and then Joe, and then I think we'll do a sum up, but I don't think we need particularly long for that. But Lisa's just put in the chat something that stuck in my mind around the issue of consent and the stigma involved with mental health, is how as soon as mental health is mentioned, everyone turns into an armchair psychologist when viewing or interpreting the work. And I think that came up during some of the presentations earlier as well. So thanks, Lisa, for that. Mandy, I'll come to you next.
It was just a thing that Dal said that struck me about the getting the views of other people who aren't artists, because I think we do need to be mindful of the fact that as artists we have a particular point of view. So the comments that Samantha and Jenny made earlier about it's just not special enough, I think it'd be interesting to see or to understand if there were people who had mental health issues but weren't artists, would they also think it wasn't special? Do we just think it's special because art's special to us?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, actually, Mandy. And I think that's what when Jenny mentioned about the medical professional saying they're not that special, and it kind of coming from a medical viewpoint, is it not? And is it because we're coming from an arts point of view? I think that's something really interesting to think about, and particularly with this group, and you know, how we think it's really, you know, important to share this art, and how, but as long as we do it properly. Are there people out there who think it's not important, and how do we, you know, approach that, and how do we kind of, you know, how do we tell our side of it? Yeah. Jo.
Two things. One that Dol said about changing the narrative or the interpretation of an artwork. It's good, but if there's an artwork that has a narrative or interpretation already connected to the artwork, you also have to respect the artist's decision for what they wanted to get across within that artwork, instead of just coming along and trying to alter what they were trying to tell. Two, on a prospect of the art therapist, I have to lean, because I am researching that aspect. An art therapist actually has a background in art, so I don't think it's a case of that they don't think that they're not coming at it from I hate art, but it's probably coming from an angle of I see this every day sort of thing. So it's an internal perspective, not an external one. So he's saying, oh, well, I see this stuff every day. It's just like, yeah. It's not unique to him. So I'm just sticking that out there. I don't think it's a case of he is a massive hater on art because he has an art background, because art therapists have to have a degree in art to do art therapy. So just thought I'd put that out there.
Thanks, Jo. And yeah, I think it is really important to think about, you know, what people's backgrounds and, you know, how they've come to this work, and that will have a real impact on how they experience it and how they feel about it as well. So I think it's, and that's what I hope about this group, is that we'll get people who do come from all those different kinds of backgrounds and have those different experiences, so we can share some of those. Michelle.
Sorry, I just I found what Joanne said then just really interesting, because to me it also is that point that maybe not all work produced in these, you know, like circumstances actually does need to be shared with everyone. It might be, you know, it's like, why are we putting the importance on it, and are we saying all the work within that realm has to be shared, or is there some like aspect of artistic interpretation around what work, you know, curation around what works best and stuff, and being honest about that as well, and not just saying everything ever scribbled in an art therapy session needs putting, you know, like exhibiting. So sorry, I know we're really near the end, but that just sparked that little thought when Jo said that yeah, it might be, yeah, like you say, he was just like, I see 300 of these every week, and there's nothing particularly that rises above for artistic consideration or something, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, Michelle, and actually something I was just going to touch on as well, because I think like a lot of work that's made in art therapy settings, the artist or person who made it probably didn't want it to ever get beyond that. And so, you know, as people who are in a position to put that work on display or share it more widely, that's something we have to think about as well, and you know, how we can make decisions on that. And I think as well, the like the curation and how it's displayed is also really important, and that was really important as part of the New Dialogues project, was to have artists involved in that, because I think, you know, it's another part of sharing that work, isn't it? How you display it, how you interpret it, how you show it to the world, really, and the impact that has on how people see that work and how they see that artist as well. So I think it's all really linked. Are there any very final thoughts? And then I'll just, Dol, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to just touch on this ever so quickly, because I feel sort of like as we're doing notes after the session, it's kind of important to put this in there, that, or is it important to put it in there, that there's a difference between artwork created by a patient or somebody that has a history of mental health, mental illness, and artwork created in therapy or closed clinical settings, because I feel like sometimes that's where we catch ourselves out a little bit, because it's right that art made in these sessions, a lot of it sometimes in some sessions gets churned out. A lot of it is stuff that people want to get it out of their heads and then forget about it. It's never meant for public consumption. And for all we know, some of the things kept in the instance of the Forgery project might have fallen under that caveat, because generally speaking, anything you create in a clinical setting, it stays, you know, what you create in the room stays in the room. And as someone that's done art processing for trauma, the things that I create, I either throw away or burn as part of the process, or I never refer to them again. They're definitely never, I never expect anyone to look at them, because they probably wouldn't make sense of them anyway, but they have a completely different end point, if that makes sense. So I wonder whether, when we're coming back to this idea of curation and what is special, that we have this idea of, was it ever created to be seen? I'm just going to leave that there.
Yeah, I think that's actually really the foundation of this. The whole topic really is something that we have to grapple with as people working in this area, and perhaps, you know, in the case of artists or people that aren't alive anymore, something that we'll never have an answer to. So thank you everyone so much for your contribution today. It's been really interesting hearing from you all. So thank you so much. And I really hope that you can join us for future meetings with the research group. So our plan is to have another session in the next couple of months that will be probably another online session, which will focus quite specifically on consent ethics, and we're going to invite people who have got so we've got a couple of people who are lawyers who are going to come and talk about it, and people who've had experience of kind of working with collections and thinking about how to the most ethical way to share them, and naming artists, anonymity, all those kinds of things. So we're putting together a kind of program for that at the moment. And then further down the line, we're hoping to have some sessions that we'll run in person throughout the year as well. We haven't fully confirmed locations for those yet, but hopefully some of you will be able to come along to some of those as well. And all throughout the project, we'll be sharing stuff through the mailing list, which hopefully you're all receiving emails from at the moment. So we'll be sharing this recording with everybody from the group. So everyone who's here today, and also people who haven't been able to make it today. And we'll also be sharing resources. And as Dole mentioned, they're going to put together a bit of a collage of people's drawings from today, if anyone does send those in. So we'll have kind of a big resource at the end that we can draw on, and hopefully put something together that will be of real use to artists, individuals and organisations working in this area. Have I missed anything, Dole?
No, I think that's it. I just wanted to leave everyone with the kind of thank you, but also to reassure anybody that might be a bit skeptical about these research groups that it is 100% mine, and I know Kate's and Charlie's intention to create something practical and physical, not just a report to sit on a shelf that never gets picked up. That's not how I roll. We want something that is real, tangible, thoughtful, and a living document that people after us can continue to work on in spaces where these artworks are displayed or even made, so that people feel empowered to have their choices and their voices respected.
Brilliant, thanks, Dole. And if anyone has got any concerns or anything after the session today, feel free to be in touch with me. I've posted my email in the chat, and I'll be checking my emails after this. So if you did want to raise any concerns or have a chat through anything, I am around.
Yeah, please do reach out. We want everybody to be safe, and just go gently.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, everyone. And it's lovely to see you all, and hopefully see you at the next one.
Thanks for having me.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.